France thought Ouattara had the power. They were wrong. A 36-year-old military captain, with no elections, no Western backing, no IMF approval, just forced one of Africa's most powerful presidents to the negotiating table. On his terms, not Abidjan's, not Paris's, his. The man the West tried to isolate, sanction, and suffocate is now the one setting conditions. So what exactly happened along this 600-kilometer border that flipped the entire power equation? And why is France watching this in complete silence? Because what's unfolding here isn't just a bilateral dispute. It's the moment West Africa's old order started breaking apart. Stay with me. The border between Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso stretches for nearly 600 kilometers. For decades, it was mostly a bureaucratic line, trucks moving, traders crossing, livestock passing through without much geopolitical weight. Today, that border has become one of the most consequential fault lines in West Africa. And the man who currently holds the leverage is not the elder statesman in Abidjan with decades of international credibility. It is a 36-year-old military captain in Ouagadougou who seized power in a coup and has since systematically dismantled every pressure campaign directed at him, including the one launched by his neighbor to the south. This is where the story gets interesting, because what is unfolding between Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso is not simply a bilateral dispute between two neighboring countries. It is a live demonstration of how the geopolitical order in West Africa is being rewritten, not in grand summits or formal declarations, but in the quiet, grinding logic of trade routes, security vulnerabilities, and domestic political survival. President Alassane Ouattara, one of the most experienced and internationally connected leaders on the continent, appears to be losing ground to a military captain most of the world had never heard of 3 years ago. And France, whose strategic interests are deeply embedded in Abidjan, is watching this unfold with serious concern. To understand how we arrived here, you need to understand what Burkina Faso actually means to Ivory Coast, not symbolically, but structurally. Burkina Faso is landlocked. It has no coastline, no major port, no direct access to international shipping lanes. For generations, Burkinabe traders, migrants, and goods have flowed southward into Ivory Coast, using the port of Abidjan as their primary gateway to global markets. An estimated 3 to 4 million Burkinabe nationals live and work in Ivory Coast. Remittances flow north. Cocoa farms in Ivory Coast are worked substantially by Burkinabe labor. The economic interdependence is deep, layered, and old. For most of this history, Abidjan held the structural advantage. It controlled the corridor. It controlled the port. If Ouattara wanted to apply economic pressure on Ouagadougou, the logic seemed straightforward. Restrict access, tighten trade, and Burkina Faso would feel the pain first. That logic, it turns out, was built on assumptions that no longer hold. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré came to power in September 2022, following the second coup of that year in Burkina Faso, Western governments and regional institutions reacted with a now familiar playbook: condemnation, diplomatic isolation, suspension from regional bodies, economic pressure. The assumption was that Traoré's government, already battered by a devastating jihadist insurgency that had displaced millions and cut off large portions of the country's north and east, would be too weak and too desperate to resist sustained external pressure. Ouattara, who had long positioned himself as a pillar of ECOWAS orthodoxy and a reliable French ally, was well placed to lead or at least support that pressure campaign from the south. But Traoré did not respond the way the playbook predicted. Instead of moderating, he accelerated. He expelled French military forces, a move that would have been almost unthinkable for a Sahelian government a decade ago. He expelled the French ambassador. He terminated the defense agreements that had governed French military presence in Burkina Faso for decades. He pivoted toward Russia, welcoming Wagner Group-linked security contractors, now rebranded under various names following Yevgeny Prigozhin's death, and began cultivating new economic and diplomatic partnerships with a speed that surprised many analysts. He deepened alignment with Mali and Niger under the Alliance des États du Sahel, creating a new sub-regional bloc that explicitly positioned itself as an alternative to ECOWAS and to French-led security architecture in the region. And critically, this is the part Abidjan underestimated. He found new trade corridors. Burkina Faso has been quietly expanding its access to alternative routes, including northward through Mali toward ports in Senegal and eastward through Niger and Benin, even as those relationships remain complicated. Togo has become an increasingly important corridor. The dependence on the Abidjan port, while not eliminated, has been meaningfully reduced. This shifts the math. If Ivory Coast closes the economic pressure valve, the pain that flows back is no longer one-directional. Ivory Coast's own northern agricultural regions depend on cross-border trade with Burkina Faso. Livestock markets in the north of the country, which supply significant portions of the country's meat consumption, rely on Burkinabe herders and traders. Disrupting that flow does not hurt Ouagadougou more than it hurts the communities in northern Ivory Coast, communities that are already politically restive and economically vulnerable. Is this simply an economic miscalculation by Abidjan, or the visible edge of something much larger? The security dimension is where Ouattara's strategic position becomes genuinely precarious. For years, Burkina Faso served as a buffer. The jihadist groups operating across the Sahel, affiliates of Al-Qaeda through Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, and Islamic State affiliates through the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, expanded dramatically through Mali and Burkina Faso. But for most of that period, the violence remained north of the border. Ivory Coast, though it suffered isolated attacks, including the 2016 Grand Bassam beach attack, was not facing a persistent internal insurgency. Part of the reason was the security cooperation architecture that existed between Abidjan and Ouagadougou: joint patrols, intelligence sharing, coordinated responses along the border zone. That cooperation has deteriorated sharply. As relations between the two governments have grown colder, the practical mechanisms of cross-border security coordination have weakened, and the consequences are beginning to materialize. Jihadist activity in Burkina Faso's Cascades and Hautes Bassins regions, the areas that directly border northern Ivory Coast, has intensified. There have been documented incursions into Ivorian territory in Hambol and Tkalago regions in the country's north. Communities are arming themselves. Local officials are raising alarms. The threat is no longer abstract or distant. This creates an almost paradoxical situation for Ouattara. The harder Abidjan pushes on Burkina Faso diplomatically and economically, the less incentive Ouagadougou has to maintain the security cooperation that keeps northern Ivory Coast stable. Traoré does not need to make an explicit threat. The logic of the situation communicates it for him. If Ivory Coast wants continued security buffer cooperation, it cannot simultaneously be pursuing economic strangulation and diplomatic isolation of the government it needs that cooperation from. Ouattara's advisors understand this. It is not a secret, but understanding a trap and escaping it are different things. The domestic political dimension adds another layer of pressure that is easy to underestimate from the outside. Ivory Coast goes into an election cycle in the coming period, and Ouattara, who is now in his 80s and whose political longevity has itself been a source of controversy, faces a coalition of opposition forces, civil society pressure, and popular frustration that is not entirely disconnected from economic conditions. Food price inflation is real and felt. The disruption to northern Ivory Coast's agricultural economy, partly attributable to border tensions with Burkina Faso, has translated into material hardship for ordinary people in regions that are already among the country's most politically sensitive. A president who is seen as having mismanaged a key bilateral relationship, created economic pain for his own citizens, and left northern communities exposed to security threats, faces serious political cost. In this context, maintaining a hard line against Traoré is not simply a matter of principle or geopolitical positioning. It carries a domestic price tag that gets higher with every election that approaches. Ouattara's room for maneuver is narrowing from multiple directions simultaneously, external leverage shifting toward Ouagadougou, internal pressure mounting from his own population, and the security situation in the north creating urgency that cannot be deferred indefinitely. What happens next on this border could quietly redefine who holds power in this region. Now consider the French dimension, because it does not sit quietly in the background. France's strategic presence in West Africa has been built over decades on a network of relationships, military bases, currency arrangements, intelligence partnerships, and diplomatic alignments that collectively amount to an informal but deeply functional sphere of influence. Ivory Coast has been one of the most reliable pillars of that network. Abidjan hosts significant French business interests. The CFA franc architecture, while increasingly contested, still structures Ivory Coast's monetary sovereignty in ways that Paris shapes. Ouattara himself has been, throughout his career, a figure comfortable within and associated with the Franco-African political and economic establishment. This is not a criticism, it is a structural description of where Ivory Coast sits within the regional order that France has historically maintained. Burkina Faso's dramatic rupture with France under Traoré was not merely symbolic. It removed one node from that network. Mali's similar rupture under the junta that preceded Traoré's alignment removed another. Niger's coup in 2023 and subsequent French expulsion removed a third. The Alliance d'États du Sahel now represents a contiguous arc of territory across the central Sahel that has explicitly exited France's security and political orbit. If the dynamics along the Ivory Coast-Burkina Faso border continue to shift in Traoré's favor, if Abidjan is effectively compelled to accommodate Ouagadougou rather than pressure it, that accommodation carries implications that reach well beyond the bilateral relationship. It signals that the pressure architecture France depends on its remaining allied governments to maintain is losing effectiveness. It demonstrates that the AES bloc, despite its security challenges, economic fragility, and international isolation, has developed enough resilience and alternative alignment to outlast Western-backed pressure campaigns. And it potentially invites other governments in the region, governments that are watching this dynamic carefully, to recalibrate their own assessments of where durable leverage lies. Ghana is watching. Senegal, under its new government, is recalibrating its own relationship with France. Togo has quietly positioned itself as an intermediary. The regional order is in genuine flux, and the Ivory Coast-Burkina Faso dynamic is one of the clearest visible expressions of that flux. Paris does not want Ouattara to drift toward accommodation with Traoré. That accommodation, however pragmatic and however understandable given the pressures Ouattara faces, carries a message that France cannot easily absorb. That standing firm against the AES juntas does not pay, and that countries with more flexibility may ultimately be better positioned than those who held the line. But Ouattara is not, in the end, making decisions based solely on what serves French strategic interests. He is making decisions based on the survival of his government, the stability of his country, and the economic well-being of his population. When those calculations point toward pragmatic engagement with Ouagadougou, French preferences become one input among several, and not necessarily the decisive one. There is a term that has been circulating quietly among analysts watching this situation: cold peace. It describes a relationship where open hostility has been replaced by transactional coexistence. Not warmth, not alliance, not genuine reconciliation, but a functional arrangement where both sides accept the constraints that reality imposes on them. A cold peace between Abidjan and Ouagadougou would mean Ivory Coast stops actively pursuing isolation of Burkina Faso within ECOWAS and regional forums. It means border trade is allowed to normalize. It means security cooperation, intelligence sharing, coordinated border patrols, communication channels between military commands is quietly restored. It means Ouattara stops lending his credibility and his diplomatic network to campaigns aimed at delegitimizing or destabilizing Traoré's government. In return, Burkina Faso maintains the security buffer. Jihadist incursions into northern Ivory Coast are managed rather than ignored. Burkinabe communities in Ivory Coast, millions of people, continue to live and work without being instrumentalized as political pressure tools. Trade continues to flow. The economic relationship that both countries need, regardless of the political temperature, is allowed to function. This is not a comfortable arrangement for Ouattara. It involves accommodating a government he has publicly criticized, operating within a regional institution that Burkina Faso has rejected, and making implicit concessions to a military captain who represents exactly the kind of unconstitutional power seizure that Ouattara and his ECOWAS partners have spent years trying to reverse. It involves telling France implicitly that the pressure campaign has limits and that Ivory Coast has reached those limits. It involves a visible retreat from a position that was, until recently, publicly stated policy. But political reality has a way of overriding publicly stated positions. And the emerging evidence, the economic pain in northern Ivory Coast, the security deterioration along the border, the domestic political pressure ahead of elections, the demonstration that Burkina Faso has found enough alternative alignment to absorb sustained pressure, all points in the same direction. The cold peace is not merely possible. It may be, from Ouattara's perspective, the least bad available option. Traoré understands this. He does not need to negotiate from desperation. His country faces genuine crises. The jihadist insurgency has displaced millions, cut off significant portions of national territory, devastated agricultural communities, and created a humanitarian emergency that his government has struggled to address. The security situation in Burkina Faso is objectively severe, and no amount of geopolitical repositioning eliminates that underlying reality. But in the bilateral relationship with Ivory Coast specifically, he is negotiating from a position of structural leverage that has grown stronger, not weaker, as the pressure campaign has unfolded. That is a remarkable development, and it has not gone unnoticed in capitals across the region and beyond. The broader implication, and this is where the analysis extends beyond the immediate bilateral relationship, is that the model of Western-backed pressure on post-coup Sahelian governments may be approaching a point of diminishing returns. The ECOWAS sanctions on Mali, the pressure on Burkina Faso, the immediate and fierce response to Niger's coup in 2023, all of these reflected a theory of change that held that isolation, economic pain, and diplomatic exclusion would either force the juntas to moderate or hasten their collapse. More than 2 years on from the height of those pressure campaigns, the juntas are still in power. The AES bloc has consolidated rather than fractured. Alternative partnerships with Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Gulf states have provided enough economic and diplomatic oxygen to survive. And now the governments most exposed to the costs of maintaining that pressure, Ivory Coast in the south, Nigeria in the west, are facing increasing domestic and structural incentives to find a different approach. This does not mean the juntas have won in any comprehensive sense. Burkina Faso's security situation remains dire. Traoré's government governs, in practical terms, only portions of the national territory. The humanitarian cost of the jihadist insurgency continues to compound. The Russian-linked security partnerships have delivered military presence, but not security outcomes. The population of Burkina Faso, which initially greeted Traoré with genuine enthusiasm, seeing in him a symbol of resistance to a failed political order, is now living with food insecurity, displacement, and a government that has tightened political space and restricted press freedom in the name of wartime necessity. The future of Burkina Faso is not settled, and Traoré's continued hold on power is not guaranteed. But in the specific theater of the bilateral relationship with Ivory Coast, the leverage calculation has shifted. And leverage in geopolitics is what matters in the immediate term. The question that will define this relationship over the next 12 to 18 months is whether both governments can construct a cold peace that is durable enough to serve their mutual interests without either side having to formally abandon their stated positions. This kind of tacit diplomacy, where the substance of policy changes without the rhetoric changing to match, is common in international relations, but it requires a degree of political sophistication and mutual restraint that is difficult to sustain when domestic audiences on both sides have been primed for confrontation. Traoré's nationalist base expects defiance, not accommodation. Ouattara's diplomatic positioning within ECOWAS requires at least the appearance of principled consistency. Threading that needle is technically possible, but it requires both leaders to manage their domestic narratives carefully while making practical concessions that their public positions would seem to preclude. There is one additional variable that deserves attention: the Burkinabe diaspora in Ivory Coast. 3 to 4 million people of Burkinabe origin live in Ivory Coast, a population that is economically integrated, socially rooted, and politically sensitive. During periods of Ivorian political crisis, this community has been targeted. In the aftermath of Ivory Coast's post-electoral violence in 2010 and 2011, Burkinabe nationals were caught in the crossfire of a conflict partly organized along ethnic and political lines. That history has not been forgotten in Ouagadougou. Traoré has made clear in various registers, direct and indirect, that the welfare of Burkinabe nationals in Ivory Coast is a matter of national concern for his government. This is both a humanitarian position and a geopolitical card. The potential instrumentalization of that diaspora community, whether through political mobilization, economic disruption, or the threat of forced returns, represents a dimension of leverage that does not appear in formal diplomatic channels, but is very much part of the background calculus. Ouattara knows that a significant deterioration of Burkinabe community conditions in Ivory Coast, whether through policy or through the social fallout of deteriorating bilateral relations, would create both a humanitarian crisis and a political flashpoint that he cannot afford heading into an election. This creates yet another constraint on the hardline approach and yet another structural incentive toward accommodation. The map of West Africa looks, at the regional level, increasingly like a zone of competing gravitational forces. The AES bloc, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, exerts one kind of pull, representing a model of sovereignty that explicitly rejects French tutelage, embraces alternative partnerships, and prioritizes security nationalism over democratic norms. The ECOWAS bloc, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Ivory Coast, represents another model, more aligned with Western institutional frameworks, more integrated into global financial systems, more reliant on the security architecture that France and the United States have built across the region. Between these two poles, the border between Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso is where the tension is most viscerally expressed. If Ouattara accommodates Traoré, the gravitational pull of the AES model extends southward. Not because Ivory Coast is about to become an AES member or expel French forces. That is not the trajectory being described. But because accommodation signals that the AES model of defiance has produced enough leverage to compel even its most stable and Western-aligned neighbors to adjust their behavior. That signal travels. It reaches Accra, Dakar, Lomé, and beyond. It reaches the junior officers in armies across the region who are watching whether military capture of the state produces durable gains or eventual collapse. It reaches the populations who are asking whether the promises of democratic governance and Western partnership have delivered the security and prosperity they were meant to guarantee. These are the stakes that extend beyond the 600 kilometers of border between Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso. The cold peace, if it materializes, will not be announced with ceremony. There will be no summit photograph, no joint declaration, no formal normalization agreement. It will appear in the data, in trade volumes, in border crossing statistics, in the gradual resumption of bilateral security contacts, in the quiet absence of Ivorian opposition to Burkinabe participation in certain regional forums. Analysts will note it. Journalists embedded in the region will report the signals. But the political leaders involved will maintain their public postures for as long as domestic audiences require it. This is how the reordering of West African influence is actually happening, not in the headlines, but in the adjustment of facts on the ground. What remains genuinely uncertain is whether this cold peace can hold, or whether it becomes the platform for something more durable. If Burkina Faso's security situation deteriorates further, if jihadist groups succeed in pushing deeper into the country's south, threatening the border regions directly, then Traoré's leverage in the bilateral relationship with Ivory Coast may paradoxically increase further, because the security spillover threat would become even more acute for Abidjan. But it could also reach a point where the scale of the humanitarian and security crisis creates pressure for a different kind of regional engagement, one that requires something closer to genuine cooperation rather than cold transactional coexistence. The alternative scenario, where the pressure campaign is renewed, where Ivory Coast doubles down on economic and diplomatic isolation, where the ECOWAS framework is used to sustain that pressure, becomes increasingly difficult to envision as the structural incentives against it accumulate. It would require Ouattara to absorb significant domestic political cost, accept continued security deterioration in his own north, and maintain a posture that has demonstrably failed to produce its intended effects. That is a difficult case to make, even to loyal allies in Paris. What you are watching, in real time, is the visible edge of a regional transformation that began with the Mali coup in 2020 and has been unfolding ever since. The old order, where France's preferred governments enforced regional norms, where ECOWAS sanctions carried decisive weight, where Abidjan's economic leverage translated directly into political influence over landlocked neighbors, is being renegotiated. Not because the juntas are wise or effective governments. The evidence on that question is mixed at best and devastating at worst. But because the tools of pressure that the old order relied on have encountered structural limits, and the governments best positioned within the old order now face the most acute incentives to find accommodation with the new one. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not plan any of this as a coherent strategic campaign. He seized power in a country in crisis, made a series of decisions that were partly ideological, partly opportunistic, and partly reactive, and found himself, perhaps as surprised as anyone, holding more leverage over his southern neighbor than Ouagadougou has held in generations. Alassane Ouattara did not plan to be in this position either. He is a credentialed economist, a former IMF official, a man who has navigated Ivorian politics through civil war, electoral crisis, and post-conflict reconstruction. He is not accustomed to being the one who has to accommodate. But the accumulation of structural pressures, economic, security, domestic, regional, is pointing him toward exactly that outcome. The border between Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso is 600 kilometers long. Every kilometer of it now tells a story about who holds leverage in West Africa, and why the answer to that question is changing faster than most observers had anticipated. The cold peace may be coming. Whether it holds and what it produces will say more about the future of the region than most of the formal summits and institutional declarations that dominate the headlines. Watch this border. The reordering of West Africa will happen here first.